Dear students, having discussed Keynesian theory of income determination, we now consider income and output determination in the classical theory. An analysis of classical theory of income and employment determination is important for comparing classical and Keynesian views on the working of a macroeconomy. Now, as it is well known to us, classical economics is that body of thought existed prior to the publication of general theory of employment, interest and money by Keynes in 1936. So, classical economics is the body of economic thought existed prior to the publication of general theory in 1936. And Keynes used the term classical to refer to all the economists who wrote about macroeconomic questions before 1936. So, according to Keynes, classical means the ideas of macroeconomists or all those economists who wrote about macroeconomic questions prior to 1936. But more conventional terminology distinguish between two periods in the development of economic theory prior to 1936. The first one is termed classical. The first one is termed classical. And this period is dominated by the works of Adam Smith, Ricardo and Mill. So, classical in the conventional wisdom means the writings of Adam Smith, Ricardo, Mill, Malthus, etc. And the second one is termed neoclassical. The second one is termed neoclassical. And it is the period represented by the writings of Marshall and Pigou. So, the more conventional wisdom distinguish two periods in the writings of economic theory before 1936. The first is classical, the second is neoclassicals. And according to Keynes, the theoretical advances which distinguish these two periods are primarily in the field of microeconomic theory. So, the theoretical advances distinguishing classical and neoclassical is in the sphere of microeconomic theory, and this is known to us from our study of microeconomics. Neoclassical theory mainly concerned with the marginal analysis, utility analysis, etc. Classical analysis mainly concerned with the supply side and the like. And Keynes felt that macroeconomic theory during the periods of classical and neoclassicals are homogeneous enough to be dealt with as a whole. So, in the sphere of macroeconomics, according to Keynes, there is no considerable difference between the writings of classical and neoclassical. So we can combine the writings of both as classical. So we denote classical system to include the writings of both classical economists and also neoclassical economists related to macroeconomic issues. Now, it should also be noted that prior to the publication of general theory in 1936, there was no single unified theory of aggregate employment. Prior to the publication of general theory in 1936, there was no unified single theory of aggregate employment. Aggregate employment or aggregate income or aggregate output, whatever it is. That is, the structure of classical economics emerged only after 1936 in response to Keynes' own theory, so that comparisons could be made between classical and Keynesian analysis of output or employment or income determination. So a unified structure of macroeconomics known as classical macroeconomics emerged only after 1936. Before 1936, writings on macroeconomic questions were shattered over the writings of various classical economists and also neoclassical economists. And this scattered views on macroeconomic questions were unified so that macroeconomic questions addressed by the classical economists could be compared with the macroeconomic questions addressed by Keynes. Now, the classical economists were well aware that a capitalist market economy could deviate from equilibrium level of income and output. Classical economists were well aware that a capitalist economy will never operate always at full employment. A capitalist economy will at times deviate from equilibrium level of output and employment. But they believed that such deviations, such disturbances are temporary and short-lived. Such disturbances, such deviations from equilibrium level of income, output, employment, etc. are temporary and short-lived. Market mechanism, the invisible hand of Adam Smith, operate quickly and efficiently to restore full employment equilibrium. Market mechanism operate efficiently and quickly to restore full employment equilibrium. So classical economists were of the view that a capitalist economy coordinated by market mechanism ensures smooth and continuous functioning. Even if there are deviations from full employment at times, it is temporary and short-lived. And if classical analysis is correct, then government intervention in the form of stabilization policies, government intervention in the form of stabilization policies are neither necessary nor desirable. So if the market mechanism ensures full employment equilibrium always, and even if there are deviations from this full employment equilibrium, and if market mechanism is capable of restoring full employment equilibrium quickly and efficiently, government intervention in order to stabilize the economy is not only necessary but not even desirable. Instead, such policies will destabilize the capitalist economy. Government policies, instead of stabilizing the economy, actually destabilize the economy. So, classical economists believed that market mechanism or price mechanism work to provide market for any good that is produced. So, according to the classical economists, in the aggregate, production of a given quantity of output generate sufficient demand for that output so that there will never be want of buyers for all commodities. That is, according to classical economists, in the aggregate, when we consider the economy as a whole, production of a given quantity of goods generate sufficient demand for the goods produced so that there will never be a deficiency of demand for commodities. Now it follows that given that demand will automatically be created to absorb whatever is produced, classical economics give little attention to factors determining aggregate demand. Classical economists did not give much attention to factors determining aggregate demand or policies that could stabilize aggregate demand to promote full employment. So, if full employment is guaranteed and if supply automatically generates an equal amount of demand in the aggregate, then there is no need for giving any attention to aggregate demand. And this is in sharp contrast to Keynesian view that a macroeconomy is characterized by deficiency of aggregate demand. So, demand management policies are required. Supply automatically responds to demand. In the Keynesian theory, demand automatically responds to supply in the classical theory. So, classical economics did not give attention to aggregate demand or policies which will promote or stabilize aggregate demand at full employment. Now, the question is, how did classical economists reach such an optimistic conclusion? How did classical economists reach such an optimistic conclusion? To answer this question, we construct a simple version of classical model which explains four things. One, determination of the real level of output Y. We construct a classical model to examine four ingredients of the classical model. One, determination of economy's level of real output Y. Real and nominal wage. Real and nominal wage, price level, and fourth, real interest rate. we will explain how classical economists reached an optimistic conclusion about the working of the economy by considering how classical economists explain the determination of real output, real and nominal wage, price level and the rate of interest. That is the classical model of income and output determination, which we will explain in detail. Before explaining all these things, remember these points. Classical economists emphasized the importance of real factors in determining the wealth of nations. Classical economists emphasized the importance of real factors in determining the wealth of nations. That is, classical analysis is primarily real analysis. And according to classical economists, the growth of an economy over time is the result of increase in the stock of factors of production, that is capital and labor, and also advances in technology. So, the growth of a nation depends on increase in the factors of production over time and also advances in technology. So, classical analysis is primarily real analysis. Classical analysis is primarily real analysis. Money played a role only as a medium of exchange, as a means of facilitating transactions, only as a medium of exchange, only as a intermediary facilitating transactions. Money has no other role in the classical macroeconomics. Now, in order to explain how classical economists explain the determination of crucial macroeconomic variables, we follow the approach of classical economists by dividing the economy into real sector and monetary sector. We divide the economy into real sector and a monetary sector. In the classical analysis, the economy is divided into a real sector and a monetary sector. Then we examine the behavior of real and monetary sectors separately by considering classical theory of income and employment determination, classical theory of income, employment or output determination, Say's law of markets. These two components are used to explain the real sector of the economy and a quantity theory of money to explain the monetary sector. So, economy has two components. In the first, we explain how equilibrium values of real variables are determined in the labor and commodity markets. And the third component, how nominal variables are determined. The values of real variables are determined in the commodity and labor market, that we will explain first. Then we will explain how monetary variables, nominal variables are determined. So, classical model is characterized by what is known as dichotomy. It is known as classical dichotomy, that is, real and monetary sectors are segregated. That means monetary variables, especially money supply, cannot affect the values of any of the real variables. So classical macroeconomics is characterized by classical dichotomy, real and monetary sectors are not related. Also, if there is a change in the quantity of money, it will affect only the price level. It will not affect the value of any of the real variables. So in the classical system, money is neutral. Money is neutral in the sense that money cannot affect the values of any of the real variables in the capitalist system according to classical analysis. Similarly, classical macroeconomics is characterized by dichotomy. So, first we will explain how the values of real variables are determined, and second we will explain how nominal variables, that is price level, is determined. And this is an introduction to the basic features of classical macroeconomics.